Have you ever wondered if Jesus even wrote something with your own hands? Most people believe not. After all, the Gospels do not mention any letter written by him. But what if I told you that there is an ancient tradition recorded by one of the first Christian historians who claims just the opposite? This mystery revolves around a distant king, an incurable disease, and a letter that would have crossed centuries hidden in the archives of a forgotten city. We are not talking about a history of fiction, but of records that are part of the Christian tradition and raise fascinating questions about the origin of primitive Christianity. If you like stories that challenge common sense, mix faith with historical discoveries, and still bring a touch of miracle, get ready. Because this letter attributed to Jesus and addressed to the King Abgar from Edessa can change the way you see the mission of him and the strength of the written word. Most people spend their entire lives believing that Jesus never wrote anything. It is almost a consensus between scholars, preachers, and faithful. But in the 4th century, a bishop and historian named Eusebius de Caesarea surprised us by stating something bold: Jesus would have written a letter. Yes, a real letter, addressed to none other than the king, to open from Edessa. The information is recorded in his work Ecclesiastical History, where he reports the content of this unusual exchange. Can you imagine the impact it would have if it were proven? According to Eusebius, King Abgar was sick and, hearing about the miracles performed by Jesus, decided to write him. This letter was not a simple real greeting, but a sincere supplication for healing and spiritual help. And the most impressive? Jesus would have answered, with its own fist. The answer letter is short, but meaningful. In it, Jesus recognizes the king's faith and promises to send one of his disciples after his ascension. This kind of content messes with us because it mixes spirituality with an almost literary touch of Christ's presence. Of course, not everyone accepts this story immediately. Many question the authenticity of the documents, as surviving texts are in Greek and Aramaic, and the originals have been lost over time. But regardless of this tradition over King Abgar and Jesus has crossed centuries as a whisper of the early Christian faith. A letter, a promise, a miracle at a distance. And to think that this may have been the beginning of one of the first missions of evangelization outside Judea makes us see this story with other eyes. King Abgar, also known as Abgar Quinto, ruled the ancient city of Isa, located where today is the southeast of Turkey. We are talking about a remote time, in the early years of primitive Christianity, when faith was still a seed sprouting on hostile soil. Isa was an important commercial and cultural center, a true meeting point between the East and the West. And King Abgar, besides being a skilled politician, was also a man deeply tormented by an incurable disease that slowly eroded him. It was in this context that he heard about Jesus and the miracles that transformed lives. Just imagine you have been suffering for years from a disease that no doctor can heal, and suddenly rumors of a holy man in Judea who heals blind, paralyzed, and even resurrect dead. For King Abgar, this was not just curious, it was a real hope. He had nothing to lose. Moved by this desire for healing, but also by a growing faith, he makes a bold decision, writes a letter directly to Jesus, asking for help. Important detail: all this before the crucifixion, at a time when Jesus still traveled villages and cities preaching the kingdom of God. The king's disease is not accurately described in the old texts, but it seems that it was serious and debilitating. Some suggest leprosy, others speak of some chronic and progressive disease. The most relevant, however, is how this physical suffering has led to a spiritual opening, something we see to repeat in many conversion stories over the centuries. What began as a search for healing quickly became a journey of faith. And that's when the letter sent to Jesus became a milestone in the Christian tradition, crossing the barriers of distance and time. The letter written by King Abgar to Jesus was not just an appeal of a sick man, it was a testimony of faith coming from someone who had never seen him personally. In his words, Abgar recognized Jesus as the Son of God, the one who performs miracles that no other man had done. He said he heard about his healing, the power over evil spirits, and the wisdom he spoke. And even being so far, in the heart of Edessa, he felt deeply touched by this divine presence that transformed everything around. It is as if Jesus' fame had crossed deserts and mountains to reach a thirsty soul. The letter, according to Eusebius de Caesarea, was written with reverence, but also boldly. The king not only praised Jesus, but invited him to take refuge in Edessa. It offered shelter, security, and welcome, as who says, "Here you will be honored as it deserves." In Abgar's head, that was more than a political gesture. It was a spiritual covenant. He wanted Jesus to be there, walking through his streets, healing his people, and, of course, bringing healing to him as well. Few kings of the time would be in such vulnerability before a traveling preacher. This excerpt from Christian tradition is touching because it reveals something we often forget: genuine faith does not need visible evidence. The king believed only for what he heard. And how many times do we need to see to believe, while others, how to open, or release only for confidence in the invisible? Your letter was recorded as a powerful example of conversion even before direct contact. And curiously, it was this gesture that triggered a response from Jesus, a written promise that would echo in the following centuries. Jesus' response to King Abgar's letter is one of the most surprising and at the same time moving accounts of Christian tradition. According to Eusebius de Caesarea, Jesus profoundly praised the king's faith with an unforgettable phrase: "Blessed are you who groan in me without seeing me." This simple statement carries a huge weight. It anticipates what would become one of the greatest pillars of Christianity: faith without the need for physical evidence. It is as if Jesus is saying that the heart of Abgar already knew him, even at a distance, even in the disease. However, Jesus also made it clear that he could not accept the invitation to go to Edessa. He explained that his mission needed to be accomplished elsewhere, a reference to the path of the cross that was still in front of him. But the most striking of the letter is in the promise he made after his rise. He would send one of his disciples to heal the king and take the good news to Edessa. That is, even without physically present, Jesus extended his compassion, showing that his love had no geographical borders or human limitations. This letter, even surrounded by debates about its historical authenticity, was, for centuries, considered by many to be a true spiritual relic. Written in Greek language, according to the preserved records, it has come to us wrapped in layers of tradition, copies, and translations. But regardless of its literal origin, what it represents is powerful: a direct gesture of Jesus, meeting the faith of a foreigner and anticipating the expansion of Christianity beyond the Jewish lands. It was as if the evangelization of the Gentiles began there, with ink, faith, and a promise. After the rise of Jesus, the promise made to King Abgar began to be fulfilled. Who was sent to Edessa was Thaddeus, also known as Adai in some traditions, one of the 70 disciples mentioned in the Gospels. Thaddeus was not just a messenger, he carried the spiritual authority of those who had walked with the Master. Upon arriving in town, he was received with expectation, hope, and, of course, a lot of curiosity. After all, rumors about the letter and the healing power of Jesus had spread throughout the region. According to the reports preserved in the Christian tradition, as soon as Thaddeus entered the palace and put his hands upon the king, healing happened immediately. The disease that had plagued him so long disappeared. It was a miracle that not only restored the king's health, but also opened the heart of the whole court to the Christian faith. It was not long before Abgar and many others were converted, and it turned Issa into one of the first officially Christian kingdoms in history. And thinking that it all started with a letter and a promise. But Thaddeus' mission didn't stop there. He remained in Edessa, preaching, teaching, and baptizing. His work launched the foundations for a vibrant and faithful Christian community, long before Christianity was accepted by the Roman Empire. The city has become a lighthouse of spiritual light in the midst of the growing Gentile world. This episode shows how Jesus, even after his rise, continued to play lives through his disciples. And for those who doubt the scope of evangelization, Issa is a living proof that a seed is enough watered by faith and miracle to flourish something grand. In addition to Thaddeus' miraculous healing, there is a fascinating detail that has made the story of Edessa even more symbolic within the Christian tradition: the relic known as the Holy Face of Edessa. According to some versions, the disciple did not arrive in the city of empty hands. He would have taken a fabric with the image of Jesus' face printed miraculously, a kind of icon not done by human hands. For many, this sacred cloth was the first representation of the face of Christ, a kind of visible sign of God's invisible presence. This artifact, which was later known as Dandelion, became the object of deep veneration over the centuries. Stored in Edessa as a sacred treasure, the fabric attracted pilgrims, curious and scholars, all looking for a glimpse of divine authenticity. There are those who say that the holy face of Edessa has inspired other famous relics, such as the Holy Shroud of Turin. The curious thing is that this relic was described in manuscripts in both Aramaic and Greek, which only increases the aura of mystery and legitimacy that surrounds its history. The presence of the Holy Face further strengthened the local faith and consolidated Edessa as one of the main centers of primitive Christianity. The city became a symbol of healing, conversion, and visible manifestation of the grace of Jesus. For many faithful, seeing that image was like looking in the Savior's own eyes. And even for skeptics, the emotional and spiritual impact that the relic was undeniable. The cloth was not just an object, it was a reminder of Jesus' commitment to those who believe without seeing, like King Abgar. Now, of course, when we talk about a letter written by Jesus, distance miracles and sacred relics, many people raise their eyebrow. And rightly so. The question that echoes is, to what extent is all this historically authentic? Eusebius de Caesarea, in recording history in his work Ecclesiastical History, states that he found the letters in the archives of Edessa, translated from Aramaic to the Greek. But the original manuscripts were never found, which makes room for doubts, interpretations, and why not? Even some academic distrust. Some modern scholars argue that the use of the Greek language in an Aramaic context weakens the credibility of the account. Others question the contents of the letters because they sound more theological than historical. However, it is impossible to ignore the spiritual and symbolic value of this Christian tradition. For centuries, the story of Abgar, Jesus, and Thaddeus shaped the faith of thousands of people. And even if the physical document has been lost, the emotional and spiritual impact remains alive in the Christian communities of the East to this day. Basically, this skepticism is not a threat, but an invitation to reflection. Historical authenticity may be debated, yes, but this does not diminish the power of the message contained in this tradition: faith, healing, conversion, and mission. The figure of the king who believed without seeing, the promise of Jesus, the sending of the disciple, the relic of the holy face of Edessa all composes a mosaic that reminds us that Christianity was not only born of official documents or records, but from the living experience of men and women played by something greater than logic. The story of the letter between Jesus and King Abgar brings up an often forgotten point from the beginning. The gospel message has already pointed to something much larger than the borders of Israel. When Jesus responds to the letter and promises to send a disciple after his rise, he is making it clear that salvation would not be exclusive to a people, but intended for all nations. Assad, with his diverse culture and his foreign king, has become a symbol of this universal opening of Christianity. A simple gesture, a letter, eventually represented a global call. This universal dimension of the Christian faith is something we need to rescue these days. Jesus' response to a Gentile king shows that God's compassion is not limited to geography, ethnicity, or tradition. It is as if he said, "Where there is faith, I will be there." The king's healing, the conversion of the people, and the evangelization of Edessa show that the gospel was not made to get stuck in temples or doctrinal disputes. He was made to reach those who suffer, who seeks, who believes regardless of where he is. It is curious to think that, long before Paul's missions or the officialization of Christianity by Constantine, there was already a seed planted on foreign soil. Jesus' letter, Thaddeus' visit, the miracle of healing, and the emergence of Christianity in Edessa are a powerful reminder the love of Christ goes beyond borders. He speaks all tongues from Aramaic to the Greek and is present where there is openness. And perhaps, by revisiting these stories, we realize that even today he continues to write letters. But now, directly in our souls, what if you received a letter written by Jesus today? What would he tell you? Perhaps something like what King Abgar said, "Blessed are you who groan in me without seeing me." This phrase, so simple and deep, continues to cross the centuries and speaking straight to the heart of those who believe, even without material evidence, even in the midst of doubts. The story of the letter, miracle, and conversion to Edessa is not just a curious chapter of Christian tradition, it is an invitation. A reminder that faith can be born of a whisper, a sincere search, a pain transformed into prayer. And more than that, it shows that Jesus' mission has never been limited to a people or place. Healing, salvation, and truth remain available to everyone who opens the heart. So tell me, what letter would you write today to Jesus? What miracle do you need? What mission do you feel you should fulfill? If this content has touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and share it with someone who also needs to be remembered that Christ's love knows no borders, neither in time nor in space.